the brand new Acura MDX TypeS. In this video, I'm going to attempt to explain the luxury three-row SUV segment. Now, if you're someone that is more budget-oriented, that just wants an appliance and you don't need a ton of features and you don't have disposable income, then things like the Highlander or the Sienna or the Palisades and the Tellurides of the world are going to do you wonderfully. There's a lot of good options out there, but this is for somebody, the Type S and the things like the other cars in this segment or SUVs in this segment, is for someone with more disposable income that wants more of a luxury feature set, tarted up interior, better drivetrains, and that's what the Type S is attempting to compete with. So the regular MDX that we did, I was left feeling a bit lukewarm. It was essentially a giant luxury barge with an average drivetrain, although reliable. It had a super soft ride, but it didn't have great driving dynamics. The interior was kind of a mixed bag, and that's what the Type S is trying to fix here. So its primary competitors, basically from low end to high end, is the Volvo XC90, which you can pretty much max out at $75,000, which is where this is at. The BMW X7 and the Audi Q7, and of course the Mercedes GLS. I'm going to focus on the XC90, the BMW, and the Audi. The difference with the BMW and the Audi is you can go from like 75 to 90, which is where this is competing, and then you can go to the next level because the SQ7 and that M60 and M50 trim of the BMW add V8s. You get things like rear wheel steering, adaptive air suspension with read-ahead technology with cameras, you have night vision, you have drive recorders, you have a whole bunch of tarted up stuff like air fresheners and all that built in. Then you can go all the way up to $120,000 plus. This is not trying to do it. It's trying to cherry pick the high-end features from those higher end products and giving you a value. Now, the question is, if you have a lot of money, do you want value? Well, that's what we're gonna get into. Starting with the exterior, the Type S gets a tarted up, more sporty looking exterior presence. More aggressive wheels. They've gotten rid of all the plastic chrome on the outside, which is a welcome thing. And then they add these Type S paint colors, which when I posted this online, people said it looked like cat piss. And I will say one thing is offering these different colors are a great thing because when you look at typical luxury car color palettes, it's silver, it's gray, it's dark gray, it's graphite, it's cobalt, it's white, it's black. It's always boring monochromatic colors. So at least they're trying something different here, whether you like it or not. The interior space, I'm going to get right into, and again, I'm not going to rehash everything I did in the MDX video, but let's talk about the pros and the cons. The things that they've done great here are, it has massaging seats, and while other brands are doing that, these actually feel like they're doing something. There is a harder object inside the seat that pushes on your back like a massaging chair. Unlike something like my X5 or X7 rather, when you push the massage button, it's just air bladders inflating and deflating. While on long trips, it has the benefit of kind of having that anti-fatigue feeling. This actually has modes where you can choose the programming from full body to kind of going up and down your back to your butt. So it feels like it's actually doing something, and that's a welcome change. The next thing that they've hit a home run with is the audio system. This is the signature 3D ELS studio setup, and it's not like the ELS ever had an issue before, but they needed to compete with the Bowers and Wilkins, the Burmisters of the world, and that's what they did. So I'm going to put up the objective charts here. This is definitely the best ELS system we've tested, and in my approximation, based on looking at the test and my listening of multiple source material, the best audio system we've tested was the XC90 Inscription Bowers and Wilkins. That is really the benchmark regardless of price. It's neutral. It doesn't get dulled down in electronic music. It doesn't matter what volume, as long as you have the settings right, it sounds amazing at pretty much any volume. This is very, very close, within probably 5% of that. It's really neutral, but you can make it you can have it a little bit more, with more pop for electronic music. The soundstage is excellent, regardless of lower volume or extended volumes, like 90 decibels. It doesn't totally fall apart. And the stereo separation is also good. When you look at how many speakers are in here, it could be an absolute disaster because it becomes a complete mess to try to tune, because you don't need speakers in the center console and the roof line to give you this effect, but they've done a great job here. So the point is, this is basically number 2 or 3 on the list of audio systems, and I've loved using it. It's way better even than the Bowers and Wilkins in my X7. So the next thing they've done great here is the physical controls. Now, we know that Acura has a ding for their infotainment. They've done essentially nothing with it since it's come out. So it's just a giant screen here that essentially just is a projection for Apple CarPlay and Android Auto. So they were smart. They didn't double down and put all the controls in infotainment. Everything is physical. You have this kind of rocker for your temperature control. You have physical buttons for cooling, seat heating, an auto button, and a dedicated button for seat massage without having it interact with the infotainment. Things like the HUD can be adjusted with your left fingers by muscle memory if you have multiple drivers. Traction control, safety button is here, and then controlled through the gauge cluster. They did a great job with the physical environment here. They didn't go hyper gimmicky trying to copy Audi with the dual screen, or even like what BMW is doing now with the new X7 or the X60 with the threaded screen and everything's gone in the infotainment. This is a good balance between old and new, and I think most people are going to enjoy it. They've added ambient lighting here where the speakers get backlight to kind of copy the luxury brands. It all seems to work very well, and it's not a bright space. So they've dumbed down and kind of lowered the brightness of all the lighting in here. You can turn off the infotainment screen, you could turn off the ambient lighting, and then even the gauge cluster, the black levels are good so it doesn't sear your eyes. Things like Audi tends to do with its setup, and Mercedes is the worst offender by far. Now, let's get into some of the other things they've done here. The negatives are, well, they haven't elevated the quality of materials. While part of the upper dash is leather, they didn't continue it all the way up. So the upper plastics on the door looks almost like a $30,000 car in the lower plastics. I would love to see them have an extended leather trim across the dash, even if it added more cost to it because it would elevate the feel. And this constant overuse of piano black across the entire center plane of this dash. It's so played out. They're doing it in minivans, they're doing it in budget cars, even cars that are $20,000, it no longer looks special. It would be nice to have an alternative option for alloys or different types of woods. They could really make this interior feel way more special than it is by diversifying materials. It just looks dirty all the time, and it's the biggest detractor. Seats are pretty good overall, and the adjustability is great in the front. Again, it's not the high-end luxury, but it's pretty decent. I would say it splits that kind of gives you a middle ground. The back seats, again, are kind of that carryover. You have the option of that removable middle seat, and then you have a true captain's chair layout in the back. And of course, you're buying this for that three-row aspect, and essentially it's the same as the regular MDX. It's somewhere in the middle. The XC90 is the most usable space in terms of cargo, even though it doesn't have the specs to show it, whereas X7 is kind of second. And then you have Q7 and the Mercedes, which are falling behind. This is basically somewhere in the middle of usability. The nice thing is they didn't put leather surfaces all over the back where the cup holders are for that third row. So when that seat is down, you're not destroying all the high-end materials. So it's a good balance in the back there. Getting in and out of this car, because now they've added adaptive air ride, you can set in the infotainment if you want it to lower down when you come into park. So it will lower down all the way if you're short, and if you want it to stay high getting out, if you're a taller person and need to put a car seat in the back, you have that extra height where you're not banging your head. And that's something even like the X7 doesn't allow you to do. You have to manually lower it before you get out. It's a pain in the butt. So I think they've balanced all the luxury features with kind of the economy features, and it really is a great, well thought out interior space. But let's get into the shop. I'm going to briefly talk about some of the mechanical changes here. Underneath the MDX TypeS, much like the regular MDX, this was a light truck platform developed specifically for luxury products or Acura products, which means you have more weld points, more structural adhesives, more sound deadening, more foams and rail points, and then, of course, double wishbone suspension. That's the big thing. And for the first time in an Acura product, they've adopted air suspension. And this can essentially go 40 to 50% softer on the spring rate side. That's because you have air springs. So when you can adjust air pressure, you have the ability to go super soft and make it more compliant over big bumps, curbing, all of that, and then you can stiffen it up. It also gives the vehicle the ability to raise itself up almost 2 inches, up to about 37 miles an hour. So if you're going over rough terrain at a slow speed, you can raise the vehicle up. But the byproduct is when you go into Sport or Sport Plus, it can lower itself down to be more aerodynamic. And with the addition of the adaptive dampers, and they're tied to the drive modes, you can make this thing even way stiffer than the traditional non-adaptive dampers. So the whole point is it can be softer, it can be firmer, it can ride better, it can raise itself up and lower itself down, which also helps when you need to get in and out of the car based on what ride height you choose. The other point is they've increased the sway bar stiffness in the front and the rear. They have upgraded the brakes here to Brembo units, and this does have brake-by-wire, which theoretically they can also adjust brake pressure based on drive modes. If you're in comfort, you want a softer pedal, they can calibrate it to that. If you want a crazy on-off switch brake pedal in the Sport Plus setting, they could do that as well. All of this is about controlling electromagnetic or electromechanical systems. Speaking of which, the 4th gen SH all-wheel drive also is updated. The front half, this is a front-wheel drive architecture first, but with torque vectoring in the rear, they can send up to 70% of the torque to the back, and then all the power either right or left based on the situation. And because the microprocessor is faster here, it reacts quicker. The pump in the rear for the torque vectoring differential is quicker. So all of these systems, including the adaptive dampers, the air ride, all of that works together, and that's why this should feel much better to drive than a traditional MDX. Much like I said in the interior, if you have the money, honestly, this is just the better vehicle. In terms of trans tuning, you have the 3-liter turbocharged engine here, which puts out about 355 pound-feet of torque and 355 horsepower. So you have the additional power, you have the better performing transmission, you have all of these subsystems working together to give you a smoother, more compliant ride, and then of course, it's super silent on the inside. But let's get this out on the road and see how it drives. Jack, MDX TypeS. Big question, why do you need this? When you have the regular MDX, which has the proven and last of its kind naturally aspirated 3.5 liter V6, and now you're trading it for a turbocharged engine, which is largely unproven at this point. So tell me, what should we do?
Well, Mark, I think we should launch this thing. We should put it in Sport Plus.
Okay. Oh, I gotta hold it.
VSC is off.
The car is lowering itself because we have air ride. Let's see what it does. Jack's on the brakes before I am. It's got one thing already, I can tell you, it's got the typical Honda brake pedal, even though it's brake by wire. You breathe on this thing and it's like 100%. So you get adjusted to that, I would say. And other than that, most of the inputs are very natural. And when I start to take a couple corners here, you're gonna quickly realize that although this is a giant boat, there is great body control when you move up to Sport and Sport Plus. What do you think?
The air ride does a good job, and SH all-wheel drive and the double wishbone suspension gets you in and out of corners much better than you would expect for basically a small condo.
Yeah, and I would agree with you 100% on that. I thought this was going to be an absolute, like, wallowy pillow, and it can be. And I think that's the good thing. In comfort, it does do that. But when you go to Sport Plus, it safely understeers, but at the same time, if you're not driving it at 100%, you do feel the rear moving a bit. And I think that's good. I expected this to be more like a front wheel drive, like a Accord sedan type thing, but the all-wheel drive system works really well here where you do feel a sense of nimbleness. And some of that is because the steering ratio is so quick here. I mean, you turn the wheel and this thing turns in.
You can feel the front suspension though load up, and you can feel the torque get delivered to the outside rear wheel, and it will slightly help you get through the corner. To me though, Mark, one of the reasons why I like this so much is when you take it out of Sport or Sport Plus and you put it into normal or comfort, the air ride goes a long way in making this a extraordinarily isolated vehicle. This rides better than the equivalent X5 and Q7, mainly because of how soft it is.
Yeah, and so I had an XC90 with air ride, and that felt like garbage compared to this. So we talked about this in the shop about Acura's first implementation of air ride. I love how soft this is, and it's almost soft to a fault, but and this is my complaint with a lot of suspension systems where they do adaptive dampers or adaptive air ride, there's not this good spread between comfort and like the firm settings. Here, comfort will get you these, as you told me, these secondary body motions where you feel a lot of this.
Yeah, it's like being on a big lake with a tiny boat. You get hit by a wave. You move around a lot. In normal, it's not as soft. There's more harshness from the impacts, but your head doesn't get jostled around as much. And as you move up the suspension mode, Sport and then to Sport Plus, where it will lower the vehicle, it's sacrificing some of that ride quality for better body control.
Yeah, and that's what I was saying about the adaptive suspension. This actually works here.
Yes.
You can go to two extremes. You can go to that super soft, like crazy soft, like suspension setting where you're feeling all this body motion, but it's great over broken pavement. And if you want to dial it out, you move up to Sport or normal. The drive modes actually have a purpose in this car.
My level of fear there went up
Why?
for a second.
What, you didn't think this thing was going to stop?
Yeah, the brakes, while they are Brembos, they are 4-piston as you talked about in the shop. I think it's because the pedal doesn't instill me with any confidence. It's all or nothing. And I don't feel like there's great feedback through the pedal or really any feedback. I have trouble, at least initially, modulating brake pressure.
Yeah, and again, that's typical Honda tuning of brake pedals. It's always been one of the bigger complaints about these things, or Honda products, is that initial stab on the pedal is always overboosted, or the brake pad compound was always like too grabby at the start, and then they tend to fade when you get into them more and more. Here, I don't really mind it. I think most of the inputs match up for what you're trying to do, and the big thing is performance-wise. We started to talk about ride quality compared to the main competitors, which, again, we've talked about this already.
X7, XC90, Q7, X5, GLE, GLS.
When we talked to Jonathan Rivers, he kind of said this splits the difference between all of them and does many things far better. And I would say this is very high on my list for ride quality for the price. What you're getting here is, for a cruiser, for a boat, I prefer it over the Q7, a little bit over the Q7 in terms of softness. However, the body control is not as good as the Q7. That, to me, is the best solid feeling car of the bunch, where this is kind of right after that, and then you get to the X5, X7, and then, of course, the XC90 is by far the worst.
See, I'm going to disagree with you. I think this rides as well, if not better, than the Q7. I think the X5, not the X7, the X5 handles quite well.
Yeah, it does.
The X7 is definitely a little bit boaty, but that is a 3-row, and to be fair, this is also a 3-row. I think this is a very strong value proposition because you get so much or so many relatively standard features or high-end luxury features for $72,000. Once you fully load this car, the equivalent X7 is $90,000 with the same options, and a X5, which again is a 2-row, not a 3-row, is like $5,000 or $6,000 more. The weak point for this vehicle for me is the drivetrain. It's not a bad drivetrain. It produces similar numbers to the B58 and the 3-liter in the Q7, but fuel economy to me is, particularly now with gas prices, is a big problem. This, in my driving, not this kind of driving, but when I just put this thing around for the first 100 miles, I barely got 18 miles to the gallon on average. The same kind of cycle in an X5, I'm getting 23, 24, 25 miles per gallon.
Yeah, and so I will agree with you there. That's a huge disappointment. And the argument's going to be, if you're spending $80,000+ on an SUV, you don't really care about fuel cost. And I would kind of agree with you, because once you get to that $100,000 range, you typically want a good drivetrain. And to me, where this kind of falls short is, it does. I mean, while on paper it meets the numbers of the competition, it doesn't have the thrust, it doesn't have the immediacy and the great tuning of the naturally aspirated B58.
You mean turbocharged inline 6 B58?
Yes, exactly. I'm sorry. And then the Q7, the engine is so smooth, and the drivetrain, the transmission programming is so smooth. Those engines are just better than this.
How was the 10-speed?
The 10-speed in this car compared to the TLX Type S, because you're not driving it like crazy, you're not going to expect the same like high level of performance out of a sports sedan. I think the transmission is great here. I obviously, if you want to manually control it, it doesn't allow you to do it, which nobody's going to want to do that here. It auto upshifts. It doesn't let you downshift, much like the TLX Type S all the time. But in auto mode, it does a great job of like understanding probably what you're doing. If you're hard on the brakes, it will downshift. Its upshift patterns, again, are almost identical to the TLX Type S. So in this, it works better because it's an SUV.
The application's different.
Right, yeah.
So Mark, do you want to get into the final thoughts?
Yeah, I think so, Jack. Final thoughts on the MDX Type S. This is one of Acura's best products. It's because they knew exactly what they were trying to do here and who it was for. And I had a conversation with Jonathan Rivers, their product planner for Acura and Honda, and he was telling me how this is like, you know, in many ways just as good as an X7 or a Q7. I'm like, I thought to myself, this dude's full of shit. There's no way that they're going to be able to do it, because when I drove the regular MDX, I'm like, it was kind of lackluster in some of the ways that those cars do well. So I'm pleased to say I am so happy with this. And in fact, if you're an MDX customer, you're looking for this and you have the money, go right for the Type S, because there's no trade-off in ride quality at all. In fact, the adaptive air ride, or the air suspension in this, is amazing. You can go from comfort all the way to Sport Plus, and there's no trade-off in ride quality. In fact, it can go from a boat, soft on the highway to feel nothing, all the way up to like a stiffer suspension where you can drive more aggressively and have really good body control. It finds a good balance between the German cars and like that Japanese car performance, or what you would think an Acura product drives like. And in fact, when you're going like 95, 100 miles an hour, it's more European, I'll be honest. It's super, super quiet and refined. They did an amazing job here. Now, some of the negatives are, you know, its interior. You can see where there's cost cutting. They've taken quality out of certain places of the dash and the doors. The infotainment is definitely a lost cause here. You know, I'm not going to go anything more than that. And way too much gloss black plastic in here. It just looks cheap as hell. The other things to talk about is the seats are not as good as some of the higher end BMWs and Audis and Mercedes. They're still good, but you know, they lacks some of the adjustability of the higher end seats, and same thing with the back seat. And they have mostly mechanical adjustments. Like the seats are all, you have to manually do them through releases or levers, versus the electronics of some of the higher end cars. That's a pro or con depending of who you are. The last thing to talk about really is the drivetrain, and it's a pro or con. This is way better than the regular MDX. The trans still needs work here, and it's less noticeable in the SUV. There's some hesitation in downshifting. The downshifts are not as smooth as the ZF gearboxes in the Germans. The upshifting is not as quick. There's not really good manual control here, so they need work in that direction. But the main thing is the fuel economy. And this is one of the huge deal breakers I had with the XC90 with the supercharger and turbocharger. I barely got 20 miles to the gallon. I thought to myself, this engine sucks. The transmission programming is average. Why am I having such a big fuel economy hit? Well, this is way better than the Volvo. It gets, on a good day, I'm getting 20 miles per gallon. And on my average commute, I'm getting 17 to 18 miles per gallon mixed. And, you know, honestly, like that's what I get in my V8 X7 that I drive. And at least with that, I have 500 horsepower and I can drive like an absolute asshole. And I'm like, okay, I'm driving like a dick. I'm gonna have to pay for it at the pump. Here, I want better fuel economy. It's not a high performance engine really on any regard. I'm not gonna have a ton of fun with it. So that to me is one of the biggest issues I have with the Type S. And if you have disposable income, maybe you'll forgive it because you like this so much. But I'm going to leave it at that. There's so many good things. This, again, I highly, highly recommend this, at least to test drive it when you're comparing some of the higher end products. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next video.